MTV and alternative radio stations have more in common than you would think. Both are a relic of coolness that are now so out of date, playing the same 5 things that nobody but a goatee-wearing 40-year-old divorcee could like. That's to say, irrelevant, running off the memory of itself, and barely alive. Still, on September 11th of 2024, the VMAs were hosted. And it felt weirder for a number of reasons. One of the reasons being that it was on a Wednesday. The second was that Wednesday was September 11th. The other reason why the VMAs just felt, off, was that for at least a decade, really since this VMAs, that I actually enjoyed the MTV Awards. It was fun, it was memorable, and a lot of the acts felt like they had a real hunger to be there and not just crossing off another stop on their PR junket. But more than anything, what really made this a strange award show was what and how little awards were actually given away on stage that night. Isla obviously got her award for Best Afrobeats Artist and Chapel for Best New Artist, but there were a lot of categories that were left out of the award show. This isn't new. Award shows have been doing this for decades, mostly to save money, keep audience engagement, as those are highly correlated to how popular a genre is. For instance, the Grammy hasn't shown a winner for Best Jazz Artist in at least 2 decades, a loss that I'm sure most of you didn't even recognize was gone. That makes sense. Why would you show the award on stage for something that people don't care about? The MTV Awards hasn't shown a rock, country, or R&B artist on stage in at least 5 years. Which also makes sense. None of these genres have held pop crossover relevance since really the 2000s. And this year, the VMAs for rock, R&B, and hip-hop were not given on stage. This didn't happen out of nowhere. Last summer, when a certain mustachioed, warbling country singer took over the charts and not a single hip-hop artist had hit number 1 for 2/3 of the year, people started noticing the shift. But to add insult to injury, not only was the number 1 song of the year a country song, but it had booming 808s behind it. The sting being that rap has been falling off the charts consistently since 2020. Music trends, audiences don't realize going on until the shift has really started to fully emerge, but the record industry will have been sweating bullets for at least the past year. 2023, for instance, pop's dominance over the charts dropped from 28% to 21%. That's how we ended up with the VMAs even show the hip-hop winners on stage. Change that went relatively unnoticed, but is critically resonant for those who are paying attention. I remember the conversations and articles that were circulating this time last year, specifically the confusion and outrage when people were realizing that the biggest songs of the year were from 2 country artists. Every think piece in the world was trying to figure it out. Witnessing right now is the early tremors of this shift. This is not just a fluke. The VMAs are one of the early signs of a broader cultural shift. Hip-hop is getting moved to the washed-up table with the aging rock bands. Proves to me what I already suspected to be true. Happening to hip-hop is almost exactly like what happened to rock in the 90s and the 2000s. I really want to start with breaking down the demographics and the audience of what we're looking at. You're a kid. You spend your whole life being told what to do, what to think, what to believe, and who to trust. But as you start to get a little older, you start to gain more independence as a young adult. You start wanting to develop your own identity, separate from what you've been taught from your parents, community, school, basically the mainstream. So you start rebelling against what you've been taught, rejecting it as a way to develop your own identity. This is why each generation has new genres that pop off that seem so controversial and contrast what they've been taught and what the last generation has been doing. In the 90s, it was grunge. In the 80s, new wave. 70s were punks. It's the natural progression as a result of the new generation waving off what the generation before did as lame, so they can stamp themselves off as the new hot shit. One of the most important aspects of forming youth culture is that it has to be cathartic. So much of being a teen and a young adult is about like brimming with this electricity, right? This energy around you that's just vibrating, just dying to come out. And youth culture needs spaces where the youth can fucking let it out. From the 1950s to about the 2000s, rock was the de facto space for young people rebelling. But by the mid 90s, it had been flipped, reversed, in every single conceivable way. Even reinvention had become stale and worn out. And so when hip hop and dance started coming through, it captured that energy that young people naturally elicit. House music and dance, they both have that natural BPM to keep up with the energy of young people. And hip hop had the lyrics and the image of youth culture and counterculture. Hip-hop and house music were quickly dominating in the underground, and after grunge figuratively and literally died, those were the two genres that were replacing it with young people. Also, both offered the capacity to let your emotions out on the floor, something that rock had really struggled with since the mid-90s. Rock got too pretentious and scattered, and by the 2000s, the hipsters wouldn't listen to Blink-182, the pop punks wouldn't listen to Neutral Milk Hotel, the Limp Bizkit crowd wouldn't listen to Snow Patrol. Basically, it all got really, really stratified. And when hip-hop and dance music were blowing up in the late 90s, as the sounds, aesthetics, and subject matter started to become more accepted into pop music. But let's focus on hip-hop. The real turning point for hip-hop being accepted into the mainstream was Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. Hip-hop was already growing quickly with a large audience through the 80s and 90s through groups like NWA, Public Enemy, but they were also really polarizing. Although we're growing, only softer groups like Run DMC and Beastie Boys were gaining any mainstream audience because of the subject matter and the sound of it as well. Things didn't change until Dr. Dre's The Chronic. When I was doing my research on this, it really took my mind a minute to wrap around this because most of my audience, including myself, we weren't alive or cognizant to really feel the effects of this. It's so like, we take it for granted now. But when Dr. Dre dropped The Chronic, this changed hip hop and pop music in two major ways. First one was that prior to this album, gangsta rap had a very specific New York sound that you were either into or not. And like I said, the imagery, the language, and just the overall sound of groups like Public Enemy were just too hardened for a lot of people. And although it was very counterculture, it wasn't until Dr. Dre came in with The Chronic and he had this sound that blended smooth funk as well as all these other different genres. He played it on live instruments and it had all these really cool digital gritty samples. And although it had relatively the same lyrical content, it was subdued enough that it made for easy listening music. So this changed the perception of hip hop from being just something that you played on a beatbox or played on the street or played in specific neighborhoods to music you could ride to. I know this sounds so like obvious because we all take it for granted, but that was a very novel and new idea at the time. And that perception of music, of hip hop music being something that you could ride to, kind of lends into my next point, which is that beyond that, hip hop evolved into music made for driving because it's literally got this heavy bass, right? And that smooth sound. The heavy bass is literally like massaging the listener, almost like they're like the vibration from the bass, like will literally massage the listener. So you're getting a sort of physiological experience along with it. So it just all kind of adds to this experience. And other aspect of it was that this was so revolutionary at the time because it changed the idea that hip hop could only be made in New York City with the New York City sound. And this broke hip hop into the mainstream even more, and it made it very flexible in its sound, aesthetics, and audience. That is what allowed all the other regions of the US to start feeling comfortable creating hip hop and the eventual rise of Southern hip hop, which has been so beautiful to watch as an ATL native. But I gotta say, as someone who is an ATL native and isn't delusional, it's obvious that our time, at least for now, is definitely coming to an end. And I say that to say, rock music died with Kurt Cobain. Everyone knows this. But it wasn't just that Kurt died, it's that so many artists from the grunge movement either overdosed or killed themselves, and that coupled with the subject matter in grunge, which initially made it subversive and edgy and cool, were now becoming subject of really intense criticism. People were starting to make the connection that maybe making super sad, nihilistic music was the reason why people were dying from the music. So when Kurt's death happened, that was the final blow for grunge rock, and there wasn't anything to replace it. Why? Rock had gone through several levels of stratification. I mentioned this earlier, but by the 2000s, the average rock listener had very specific tastes, and those tastes said a lot about who they are. For instance, the Nickelback hate of the 2000s. Nickelback was the most popular dominant band of the 2000s. No argument about it. They played everywhere. They were hard to escape. But one of the biggest cultural ethos of rock was the idea of being connected to the underground and not selling out. And Nickelback, by every metric in their eyes, they're sellouts. They sell out arenas, albums, singles, and they were entirely commercially focused. And hear me out. Nickelback was the Drake of rock music, an artist that most real fans of the genre hated, but you could play it in the background for a long enough period of time until the backlash was just too much. When Nickelback's backlash reached its pinnacle point, around like 2009-ish, it got to the point where if you were caught dead listening to it, you were either mocked or at the very least, someone was going to make a Nickelback joke. And the same could be said to anyone who was willingly putting on a Drake album or song post-April 2024. I say all this to say, although Nickelback was rightfully hated, it was the only mainstream pillar holding the frail tent of rock music upright. And when that eventually lost its relevance, nobody came to replace them. Rock had effectively become a niche genre, with only pop punk, indie rock, and the dreaded hey-ho stomp clap bands left to fill the void. And none of them were really large enough to sustain it. Sure, they all had crossover hits on the charts, but you never saw these bands take off and reach the levels of success that bands received in the 80s, 70s, 90s. If I asked you to name all the members of a band you like right now, I bet you couldn't tell me. Go ahead. Tell me all the members of Beach House. I dare you. But a generation ago, at the very least, most people knew the lead singer or whoever was the most fuckable. I'm making a tangent here, but my point is that rock became a singles game. And once you lose your mainstream artist in your genre, you are effectively niche. And now you are not only playing to a smaller audience, you're playing the singles game. You don't have a major audience looking to see when you drop your album. And the same, I suspect, is happening to rap within a different way. They're playing the singles game, but for TikTok. Artists like Bossman D-Lo, Ice Spice, they don't have mainstream audiences. And as hip-hop becomes more and more niche, what's going to happen is we're going to start seeing some really niche, weird stuff going on that we look back on and be like, oh my gosh, do y'all remember this? Because right now, rap is in its limbo period. Like, do y'all remember the ringtone rap era? Oftentimes, when one era ends, there's like this weird scramble to find the next big thing, and people will grab on to the most gimmicky idea, swearing that it's up next. And when that fades, and the real genre shift happens, it'll usually happen gradually, and it lasts a lot longer, like the 2010s rap that followed post the ringtone rap era. Another good example of this was that weird dead zone of rock between the quiet pewtering out of 80s hair rock in the late 80s and before grunge entered the space. So it was like that late 80s to early 90s era. It was like this weird dead zone where the record labels were scrambling to figure out what the next big thing was. And everyone was trying to figure it out. And all these super niche sounds that were definitely never going to be it were being hyped like it was next up. And it's funny because when I was researching for this video, a lot of big dreams were being sold to those bands and artists. And I can't help but notice the parallels with the few artists right now. There hasn't been a bigger energy shifting moment than the lockdown. Wars, recessions, Those happened like clockwork, but nothing could have prepared the Western world for this. Every single generation was fucked up by this. It was a singular event that shifted the energy for everyone. But one of the biggest energy changes that I noticed was that people stopped wanting super negative, nihilistic stuff, just like how things happen post-grunge. There's just no other way to describe it. But if you were there at the time and you're someone who picks up on vibes, you will remember how up in the air everything was. People were just so ambivalent about everything. I remember feeling so lost when lockdown happened. And I vividly remember this moment where I Googled, how long do you think the lockdown will last? And nothing came up. And I haven't Googled something and seen a page where literally nothing came up since probably 2010. I just remember that moment feeling this just rising sense of panic just crawling up my throat, and just like this intense level of claustrophobia that I've never ever had before. And it's the kind of claustrophobia that just cannot be understood until it's experienced, and you carry it on with you for the rest of your life, and it'll shape your decisions from there on. And the byproduct was that a lot of people, I think, had reached their limit of nihilism, apathy, and hedonism. And I don't think I need to spell out how that affects hip hop. In my opinion, hip hop officially entered the mainstream pop zeitgeist around 2017. Yes, obviously there were huge rap artists before that, but even in the 2000s and in the 2010s, if somebody told you that Future, Lil Durk, or Roddy Ricch would be doing singles with Taylor Swift, Morgan Wallen, or spending almost a year at #1, that would be utterly ludicrous. Rappers don't do songs with Taylor Swift. Maybe a pop R&B artist like Rihanna or Rita Ora, but the idea that a rapper could potentially do a song with Olivia Rodrigo would seem insane in 2013. But today, you wouldn't even blink an eye. And I think that's due to a lot of really big shifts that happen in music. And you could also argue that some of this was related to the political climate at the time as well. Todd in the Shadows mentioned this in his Katy Perry video, which you should definitely go watch. But by 2016, all the pop hits were very depressing, very downbeat. I mean, even the music videos were like dark and sullen. Like artists like Katy Perry with their candy color sound and aesthetics, they didn't stand a chance. And I do think that was directly correlated to the election. And I'm not going to go into politics, but when Trump got elected, the day after, I remember going to school and it was depressing. Poptimism, the idea that pop music should be an upbeat and critiqued like any other form of music, was so huge during the Obama era. Club music was thumping. There was this like sense of hope that was truly palpable. But by 2016, that was all gone. And along with it was a new generation of white and non-black young people who grew up in the 2000s and the 2010s. And they were used to hip hop in their periphery. By the time these non-blacks were in their teens and early 20s, they were listening to hip hop as a part of their regular rotation. Something that like 10, 20 years ago, only a small portion were doing. Now I'm going to say something that might sound a little controversial, but I think a large part of why hip hop blew up during this time period is the same reason why I think Trump is going to win this election. There was a lot of white guilt going around at the time that is completely gone today. So many people were sick about the outcome of the election, and in a way, it seemed like a lot of young non-black people were listening to hip hop more after Trump was elected. I don't know if it was conscious, but maybe because a lot of those kids whose parents likely voted for Trump, or maybe they were in some way wanting to feel rebellious, started consuming a lot more of hip hop. That coupled with the fact that they grew up listening to hip hop in their periphery, right? Maybe a Kanye song here or there, maybe a Jay-Z song or a Lil Wayne or a Nicki Minaj song here or there. Something that 10, 20 years ago, a generation would have never done. Not to mention, 2016, 2017 was when a lot of social justice and intersectionality ideologies were starting to gain more mainstream appeal. And that was largely by young people, and particularly by a growing young non-black population. Because again, youth culture. I'd even go so far as to say that when Lil Baby dropped Bigger Than Us in 2020, that brought even more of that white guilt audience. No cap, I'm black and I've never heard a black person be like, hey yo, put that Lil Baby song on, and they put on Bigger Than Us. We already know our situation as black people. I do not want to hear Wheezy out of here and then the saddest set of 16s following that. I'm good. I remember being at a rap show between 2016 and 2020. Because if you did, y'all would remember there would always be just like this wave of non-black, like fratty looking guys, right? Wearing either like some kind of Hawaiian shirt or a basketball jersey, no in between. And those are the people I'm talking about. And no shade to y'all. Shout out to y'all for showing up. But I could tell you that as someone who was listening and going to shows, even as far as 2013, I went to go see Chance the Rapper and Tyler the Creator separately in 2013. And both shows were mostly black. Although I will say the Tyler the Creator show had a little bit more white people and hella Mexicans. Shout out to my Mexicans. But when I went to go see Young Thug in 2016, I saw them at a frat house. I saw them at a frat house in Georgia Tech. Fiji Week. If you know, you know. Not only do they have Young Thug perform in 2016, I want you to understand, Young Thug in 2016, this was before Pick Up the Phone had dropped. He was not a mainstream artist by any stretch of the imagination. So for a white frat to be tapped in like that, you get what I'm saying. But my point is that by 2016, listening to hip hop as a non-black person was not niche anymore. Rap had officially taken over as youth culture music. I mean, just look at the lineup of Coachella over the years. They didn't even start introducing real rap acts at the top of their lineup until about like 2015. If that doesn't tell you everything, I don't know what will. And it makes sense when you think about what they were rebelling from. So many hip hop artists were screaming "fuck Trump" at their shows. Is it any wonder that given the climate at the time that there were so many people that were attracted to it? Remember how I said rock music got really, really stratified? The same thing is happening to rap now. When you're in the early stages of a genre, people are excited, so people are experimenting with what they like. But by the time a genre hits the mainstream, people have started forming their own conclusions, and more importantly, people have started identifying themselves according to the music. If you ask someone in 2018 what a Future fan looks like, he could look like this, or he could look like this. My point is that you didn't have to have a specific identity to like the music, except maybe being a misogynist. But my point is that if I asked you what a Destroy Lonely fan looks like, they are going to have a very specific look. They're going to have very specific sound. They're going to have very specific tastes as well. If you walk up to a Destroy Lonely fan and you're like, hey, do you listen to NLE Choppa? They're going to scrunch up their face and look at you so crazy and call you corny. And this is exactly what happened to rock. What starts to happen, and this is what happened with rock, is the purity argument starts to happen. So certain artists and their fan bases start to become deemed as not real rock, right? And they start getting vilified, which in turn starts to create a bigger gap between the mainstream band or rapper and their audience to the smaller bands or rappers that are seen as real. The mainstream side sees the other side as pretentious. The other side sees the mainstream side as corny and lacking depth. And this actually fucks the money up. And when the money starts to get fucked up, everything starts to get fucked up. The music business in general has not truly been profitable for a long time. We know this. You want to know when I realized they weren't making money off of rap artists anymore? Go look at any music video right now. Especially if it's for artists that are up and coming and have a lot of buzz right now. Because the budgets for what they're putting into new artists will tell you exactly the state of where the label is at. Most of these videos look cheap as fuck, okay? I've done a lot of music videos for a lot of hip hop artists. I remember I did a music video for 21 in 2017. They bought all of us seafood boils. Yes, it smelled crazy in there, but I just did another video a few weeks ago for an upcoming rapper with a lot of buzz. They had water and fruit snacks. I'm not trying to shit on anybody, but do you get what I'm saying? I don't want to get too far away from the point, but I digress. I'm just saying, look at how many labels are downsizing right now. If you're an artist and you have a lot of label connects, you might want to go check on those connects because you might not have connects anymore. Take a look at Atlantic, for instance. They have had record layoffs, which is signaling that they're not making any money. When a label is scrambling for money, you can always tell. First, they start firing people and cutting down on divisions. Then they start streamlining on execs on the board. And if that doesn't work, then they start dropping artists. Atlantic reportedly dropped 50 artists a few weeks ago. Now, we don't know which artists were dropped, but it is being rumored that a lot of these artists that were being dropped were rap acts, specifically hard rap. It's being reported that their biggest mistake was a $400 million investment into 300 Entertainment, which is a personal project by Leor Cohen, who's a huge record label exec who's had huge influence. And 300, which is the label that he created, exclusively signed hardcore rap artists. And most of them have produced no real hits and no real names. Their two biggest artists come from YSL, Gunna and Young Thug, who are currently facing a RICO indictment right now. And I think this leads into my next point, which is that we already talked about the fact that people are looking for a more positive vibe. And the two biggest themes of hip hop currently that have made it so counterculture is its hypermasculinity, hyperviolence, and hypersexuality. And the former, we're already seeing a rebuttal from. And the latter, well, you can say Cassie wasn't a strong singer, but she certainly changed the landscape of hip-hop forever. And in response to all of these indictments, I don't think it's a coincidence that country and Afrobeats have been replacing the rap and hip-hop singles on the charts. Both offer a sense of masculinity, sexuality, and romance in less overt ways, which right now is refreshing. Espresso was one of the biggest songs of the year, and I remember specifically people realizing just how dirty the song was.
Is any song not about sex?
And freaking out. It was all over my timeline on TikTok, and I just remember thinking, like, really? Like, we're really gonna act like this song is, like, so freaky? Like, just 2 years ago, we had a song playing actively on the radio station called Throat Baby. That to me just says so much about where we are, because somehow making a clean song that suggests more than it overtly says has become more exciting and illicit. Tyla's Water, for instance, to Throat Baby. It's the difference between a sensual strip to stripping completely naked on the spot. And you know, Afrobeats music is so chill and it's vibey, and I think it's basically what reggae was in the 2000s, like when Sean Paul, Daddy Yankee were all like really catching a wave in the 2000s. But I think that the reason why it never made its mainstream appeal in the 2000s was global music hadn't really become a thing yet. Now, because we're so interconnected through our phones, we have access to global sounds, global aesthetics in a way that we never did before. Regionality is dead. Monoculture is dead. So now I think sounds like Afrobeats and even Latin music have had the ability to have mainstream influence in America while also being able to have a huge global influence as well, which means it's going to start taking up more of the market share. Where the money follows, that's where the labels go too. I mean, it's very international. You don't have to think about the lyrics, and it also kind of incorporates hip-hop elements without the same subject matter and material. Country music is the literal antithesis of hip-hop, and I'm gonna be honest, I think the biggest reason why country music has started to replace hip-hop is the same reason why I think Trump is going to win this election. A lot of the same young people who bumped Future in 2016 and probably had BLM in their bios are now the same people who are going online, going on TikTok, saying, I was a part of the BLM pipeline and it was cringe. Look throughout history. One thing about white guilt is it's cyclical. Look throughout American history and you'll notice periods of white guilt driving more people to the left, only to then abandon said cause about a decade or so later. The I was a part of BLM, it was so cringe pipeline is not new. I have a neighbor back home at my parents' house who let everybody and anybody know that he was a part of the Rodney King protests in LA in the 90s. Today, he has a giant Trump flag on his front lawn that is so big it can cast a shadow wide enough to host a family picnic. My point is that this is not new. This is not a new phenomenon. And when white/non-black people move away from hip hop, much like Ariana Grande, Miley, Pink, J-Lo, and so many others have, it's usually because they either can't take the heat or they have moved past that era of theirs. To them, it's just a cringy phase that they went through. And again, the age range, regardless of race, once any person has finished that cycle of youth rebellion, most people return back to their roots. But even outside of that, hip-hop has oversaturated itself. A lot of why hip-hop was the rebellious music of a generation was that it was talking about a lot of taboo subjects that would make older generations clutch their pearls. But now, nearly after 2 decades of accelerating violence, misogyny, drug abuse, and more, it just doesn't hit anymore. The shock value is gone, and the only thing left to feel is just apathy. And after a decimating pandemic, who the fuck wants to listen to music where someone is just being not only negative, but maliciously so? If you notice, the rappers that have fared the best this year or have blown up recently haven't really been the ones who have been overly misogynistic, who have been overly hyper-violent. I mean, shit, the biggest rap song this year is a man holding another man accountable for being a fucking pedophile. If that doesn't tell you where we are as a culture, I don't know what will. And environment-wise, a lot of other outside factors contributed to its fall. It's crazy how each genre will blow up, and then even if the people in that genre don't end up leading to its demise, oftentimes outside forces do it better. AIDS was the death to disco. The Berlin Wall was the death of cheesy 80s rock. And the consistent list of rappers going to jail or dying was a major setback for rap to keep going. Just like the deaths of Kurt Cobain, Chris Cornell, Scott Weiland, and Lane Staley, the equivalent of that for hip-hop was YSL getting locked up, plus all the deaths that happened in that time period. The SoundCloud wave of rappers, most of them perished. That sound never got on its own 2 feet. I think about that all the time. It's heartbreaking. I remember the day Juice WRLD died, and I just knew that was the end of an era, and that era was so short. And finally, the YSL case, which has not only rocked Atlanta, which had been the home of hip-hop for effectively the last 10 years or so, but people started getting exposed as snitches and all this other stuff, so the illusion was shattered. And not to mention, from a financial standpoint, as a label, it doesn't really make sense. Think about it. Atlantic, for instance, they dropped 50 rap artists, which means they signed a lot of rap artists, most of them hard rap, as I mentioned earlier. And you got to deal with the fact that a lot of these dudes are living the lifestyle that they're talking about, right? To keep that authenticity up, that relatability and that credibility, which means that the labels are putting a lot of money into keeping them out of jail, into lawyers and all this other stuff, and they're not getting much return on it. Most rappers do not do well album-wise. They are not strong performers on stage, which means they don't sell tickets well, which means they don't make a lot of money off of merch. It's hard to get a return on investment in general, particularly with rap artists. And essentially, it's just a lot of risk. And at this point, there's just not much reward. Hip hop as we know it was bound to get stale. I mean, even look at pop music in the last 3 years from the pandemic. The sound of it is getting more optimistic. Artists aren't popping Xanax or perks anymore. If you want to know the energy of a generation, pay attention to what drugs they're doing. They're choosing ketamine, poppers, and uppers. Okay, people are over the downers. People are over the depressants. Literally over the depressants. The fact that people were legitimately excited for a Katy Perry single after she had already dropped 2 flop albums that nobody gave a fuck about says a lot about the climate of which music, particularly pop music, is in. But the good news is, I do think that what's coming next is going to be exciting. I predict that we're going to see a wave of rock music coming back with mostly black and non-white faces. The twee, upper middle class, white kids making rock, I'm sure they're always going to have a space, but we've done that already. There's nothing left for them to say. I think that the most counterculture and rebellious thing that we're going to see coming forth is Black people taking over genres that have died and that need to be reinvigorated. We're seeing that with country right now, and we're going to see that with rock. Quote me on it. As we look ahead, it's very clear that the energy of youth culture is changing. The drugs, the fashion, the music, we're all kind of moving away from the dark, nihilistic themes of the past decade, and we're returning to this sort of like the classics, this optimistic, tee-hee with a wink vibe with, you know, a little postmodern twist. I think that the next big sounds are going to be the ones that capture the optimism and hope that people are craving right now. And I don't know, I could be totally wrong. You guys let me know. I do think that at a certain point, being so mysterious and dark and nihilistic and apathetic becomes cringe, because it pigeonholes you to be in a position where you can only like and do certain things. And after a while, people get tired of that. I mean, look at what followed the grunge movement. What followed grunge music was the most upbeat, hyper upbeat and optimistic pop music ever. I mean, that's when we got the most insane levels of boy bands and Britney Spears and insanely girly and fun music. And that's exactly what's happening right now. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. I know it's been a long time since I've dropped a video. I'm so grateful for y'all. 1K might not seem like a lot to a lot of people, but I remember when my account had literally like 10 subscribers. That means everything to me. I really hope you guys know that. And shout out to all of you guys who comment consistently in my videos. I love you guys so much. I don't know how I'm going to make it up to y'all, but just know I will. And I really do. I really mean it. For the people who've been showing love from the beginning, insert names of those people. I thank you. I really do mean it.